Director. Thanks. My name is Robert Harrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Consumer Federation of California. And thank you for joining us for the second in a series of talks where we're going to be discussing some items today with Diana Moss. I'll introduce Diana in just a second, but just by way of reminder, this is part of the campaign that we're doing, Are You One of the 19 series of talks. This relates to not just wealth and equality, but the public policy dynamics that come from that inequality and the class of folks who, particularly in the tech fields, but not exclusively in that fields, are really driving a lot of public policy decisions at the federal and state level. So today we have the great pleasure of being joined by Diana Moss. Diana is Vice President and Director of Competition Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute, PPI. Prior to that, she was President of the American Antitrust Institute. And before that, Dr. Moss worked at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Those of us who've been in the public policy business for a while remember when FERC was on all of our lips and tongues. I had the honor, privilege, maybe that's not the words, of working on some energy policy stuff right around the time of the blackouts and things in California. So FERC was on our minds quite a bit. So we've asked Dr. Moss to come here today to talk about antitrust writ large, and then she'll give her talk for a while. There is something at the bottom called Q&A. Folks can put their questions in the chat, and we'll curate those. And when she's done, we'll ask some questions. And then there has been some interesting developments this week in the antitrust front at the federal level, at the Federal Department of Justice. So we'll probably touch on that too in the conversation. So without further ado, let me hand things over to Dr. Diana Moss. Diana, thanks for coming, and we look forward to the talk and then the conversation afterwards.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks to CFC for inviting me on today. It's a Friday. I know everybody is winding down their weeks. Our week is just winding up with some very troubling news out of DC on the antitrust front with the ouster of Gail Slater, who is the head of the antitrust division at the U.S. Department of Justice. We'll talk about the implications of that a little bit later, but the reason why I mention it here at the beginning of the talk is because we have 100% moved into a very politicized environment arena around federal antitrust enforcement. And that is unfortunate. It's does a great disservice to competition enforcement, to protecting our markets, to protecting consumers. And it also is a giant flag for the importance of strong state enforcement as not as a backup, but as the go-to public form of enforcement. And then, of course, we have private antitrust enforcement as well. So we're living and working in my world in a very politicized competition enforcement arena. And I do want to give a shout out to consumer advocacy. I've worked with consumer groups my entire career. You all serve an incredibly valuable and important role in translating a lot of these sometimes complex competition issues into how they impact consumers through higher prices, through lower quality, through a loss of innovation, a loss of choice. And I have worked side by side with consumer advocates on lots of issues, ranging from airlines to tech to media, telecoms, agriculture, and food. So appreciate your work, admire your steadfastness in promoting the interests of consumers. So let's just start off here. I only want to talk for about 20 minutes total and then field some questions because I'm sure you've got them. But I want to just set the table for where we're at right now in terms of market power in the US economy. We are at a stage in critical sectors, and I'll call out the very consumer-facing sectors where we have very high levels of concentration. We have dominant firms, we have tight oligopolies of firms, for example, that have very weak incentives to compete hard on price and quality and innovation. We have dominant firms who can really jack up price because they have market power, but also with strong incentives to exclude smaller rivals, right? We need those disruptive smaller businesses to keep everybody on their toes, to keep prices down, and to have fair markets and access to markets for workers and for consumers. Um, we're not seeing a lot of that in some really important sectors. PPI did a report last year called "Is Antitrust Doing Enough to Protect Consumers?" And what we did is we unpacked the big areas of spend for consumers. You know, what makes up the big consumer budget? Well, you all know what that is. It's housing, it's food, it's healthcare, it's contributions to pensions, it's transportation, and the median salary for for the average working American household in 2025 was about $62,000 a year. Most of the spending on those big five areas amounted to just about $62,000 a year. So, the working American family has nothing left over. Um, um, and may in fact not even have enough to buy those necessities. So when we talk about competition enforcement, antitrust enforcement at the state level, the federal level, private enforcement, and we talk about regulation, which obviously has an important component of spurring competition or stifling competition. We are talking about agencies with limited resources, right? Um, Federal agencies have funding that is appropriated by Congress. That has become very politicized. State agencies like the California Attorney General's office, obviously, appropriations. But the bottom line is antitrust enforcement agencies don't have a ton of money to spend. They can't, it's not a blank check. They can't go after every single competition problem in the economy. So they have to make really careful choices. And I have done a lot of advocacy explaining why we should be focusing on consumers and consumer facing sectors. And the other big reason for that is, other than lowering the cost of living rate for American families, which is sky high right now. I mean, it's a political issue. That's what turned the election in 2024 was the very high cost of living and the lack of relief to consumers and getting prices down for the basic necessities. Um, but um, the other troubling piece of analysis we did, or results from analysis we did, was that merger enforcement in particular is very weak in these consumer facing markets, right? We unpacked every single market that goes into housing, into food and agriculture, into healthcare. We looked at every single market. We looked at rates of federal merger enforcement, and what we found was that the number of cases, mergers that have been challenged by the agencies is well below the average across all sectors in the US economy. That's a bad sign. It's a bad sign when merger enforcement is in these consumer facing sectors is below average. It means that consumers are not getting the kind of safeguards and protections from vigorous merger enforcement, at least at the federal level. So we called all that out in a very constructive way, and it is incredible how much traction we have gotten and conversations we've had with states, state legislators, lawmakers, governors, state attorney generals, consumer advocacy organizations, competition organizations, farm groups, healthcare groups. When they realize that merger enforcement has been very weak in these sectors, it really sets off the alarm bells. So, when we talk about, say, the digital tech sector and what's going on there with a lot of the big monopolization cases against the techs, Google and Facebook and others, we also have to think about how many resources are being spent on those cases that may have been diverted away from enforcement, more vigorous enforcement in consumer-facing sectors, where market power translates directly into higher prices for consumers, which drives up the cost of living for consumers. So I just want to put that out as sort of some table setting issues. Other than the weak merger enforcement, what we're seeing in some of these consumer sectors is very concentrated supply chains, right? Look at food, where we have producers up high in the supply chain, farmers, ranchers, growers. We've got meat packers, for example, poultry processors. In sort of the middle part of the supply chain, we have all the inputs like fertilizers and seeds, and then we have retail grocery chains, and then we have the consumer eater at the very bottom of the supply chain. That supply chain in food and agriculture in the US looks like an hourglass. It's got this enormous bottleneck in the middle, and the bottleneck is high levels of concentration, very limited competition in those supply chains. So what we've seen is that there is a lot of bargaining power, where the only way that firms know how to deal with powerful input suppliers and powerful purchasers of their commodities is to get bigger themselves and to merge, to get bigger, to be a bigger, better bargainer with somebody that you are purchasing from or that you are distributing through. That spells disaster for consumers, right? That just means more and more market power in the supply chain, a more fragile supply chain that can't survive pandemics or drought or disease or anything like that, as we saw during the pandemic. And that is just a recipe for higher costs and less choice for US consumers. Um, and so, to California's credit, the California Law Review Commission a few years ago opened up a study to look at the California Cartwright Act, which is one of the two really major statutes, California, New York. New York has a Donnelly Act, California has Cartwright. They opened up an inquiry to talk about reforming the Cartwright Act to sort of modernize it, to update it, to strengthen it, so that California can do a better job of protecting competition and protecting consumers and workers. That was a very long process. I actually served on a task force on concentration in California. We unpacked all the big sectors, healthcare, entertainment, for example, food and agriculture. California is the fourth largest economy in the world, and there are very, very high levels of concentration in some of these California sectors. Um, and there has been a movement under the Biden administration. There was sort of an ideology that had taken hold in the antitrust community, the competition enforcement community, that we needed to have stronger laws, presumptions that certain mergers, for example, and certain types of harmful anti-competitive conduct would be presumptively illegal. And so this sort of developed into some thinking that big is bad, and that antitrust should be really the tip of the spear or the lead dog for approaching all problems, economic market power problems, concerns over environmental degradation, social problems, political power. And antitrust really was, front page news under the Biden administration. And we had some very aggressive enforcers who actually did some really important stuff. But we also had an enormous focus on big tech coming out of the Biden administration, and we now have these very large monopolization cases that are bubbling through the courts. They take a long time, bubbling through the courts, and we're getting decisions now on cases like the Google search case and the FTC's case against Meta and Facebook. So we're now seeing how those cases have evolved and what the state of the law is after all of this case law has accumulated. So I'm not in the camp of necessarily as big as bad. What camp I am in is that antitrust is a very, very important tool for protecting competition and markets and consumers. But what we need are some very clear guidelines for the courts to follow on how to interpret cases and look at evidence and look at facts. And we need some sort of standard to assess how anti-competitive conduct or anti-competitive consolidation harms consumers. And we have a very important standard out there that has has been flexible and has worked well for a long time. It's called a consumer welfare standard, which can look at the effects of anti-competitive conduct and consolidation on prices, on quality, on innovation, even on choice, for example. That popped up in the JetBlue Spirit merger for you airline fans. Um, so what we're dealing with now is there was a lot of hypothesizing that as the Biden enforcers exited stage left and the Trump 2.0 enforcers came in, that we would be moving from a more left-leaning populist ideology around antitrust to a more right, a populist ideology that might be similar but coming from the right. And boy, that's sure not what turned out to be the case. Instead, what we have is uh, uh, what we have is a very politicized antitrust environment where companies curry favor with the White House to get their mergers through, where deals are interfered with, where the Justice Department does not have the ability to do independent reviews and to litigate cases and to follow due process and rule of law. So we have almost the polar opposite of what was going on in the Biden administration. So all of this sort of sets the table for what reforms have been proposed in California. And one of the biggest initiatives, so the California Law Review Commission process is looking at pretty much everything, right? The Cartwright Act, as it is, can go to what we call concerted conduct, where firms collude with one another to jack up prices or to divide up markets and stifle competition. But there has been interest in expanding the scope or of the statute, the Cartwright Act, to include to be able to look at mergers, to be able to also look at what we call single firm conduct, which is classic monopoly, right? A single firm exercising, wielding its market power to raise prices by excluding its rivals, making it harder for smaller firms to compete. And that's what's really on the table in front of the state legislature right now. And this proposal, single firm conduct proposal, creates a very broad. It's very broad and it's very flexible and gives plaintiffs, antitrust plaintiffs, um, and antitrust defendants, for that matter, a big playing field to work on in terms of alleging that firms possess monopoly power and used monopoly power to stifle competition and to harm consumers. And so, given everything that's going on in the economy and concentration issues, it is no surprise at all that a single firm conduct proposal came out of the California Law Review Commission to expand the Cartwright Act, to strengthen, to modernize the law. And it has gotten a lot of support, but it's also, very, very controversial because it is a very broadly written statute. It does not contain a lot of guidance for the courts on what they should look for as evidence of monopolization and harm to consumers. It doesn't even include a standard as to what the courts should be looking for. Is it higher prices? Is it lower quality? Is it less innovation? So, in the camps that have developed around this single firm conduct proposal coming out of the CLRC, um, there is, for the pro enforcement community, of which I am certainly a part, there is a lot of support for states to be vigorous antitrust enforcers, especially with what's going on at the federal level, right? If we're not going to get due process and rule of law at the federal level, states have become more active in recent years. There have been some really strong cases. Kroger Albertsons, for example, Sprint T-Mobile, these are big cases. States have become more activist, and that's great. And so if we care about protecting competition and consumers, we should absolutely be looking to the states. So it's no surprise that states are attempting to reform and redefine their antitrust laws. New York has done it with the Donnelly Act. That's been an uphill battle to get changes there. California is now rolled out its first proposal, and it is also controversial. But that's the tension. It's the importance of state enforcement, the logical developments around strengthening the Cartwright Act to cover all sort of a broader set of concerns. about anti-competitive conduct and even anti-competitive consolidation. But at the same time, it's really important for folks to realize that um, we want enforcement to work efficiently. We want it to work effectively. And so that means that both plaintiffs and states are plaintiffs and defendants, companies, for example, who are accused of behaving in an anti-competitive way, that they have some sort of transparency and predictability in the process. And we need judges to be able to have guidelines, to have some benchmarks in how they evaluate evidence and arguments. And that really is what the debate is all about right now. And that's what I think will be hashed out in the state legislature here in the not too distant future. So I think stay tuned on that. Keep your eye on what's going on at the federal level, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more. Absolutely. Know that state enforcement is vitally important and imperative, and that if the feds aren't going to do it for US consumers and enforce the laws fairly and aggressively, then state enforcement is going to have to step up and fill that gap. And then, of course, we have that third leg of the stool with private enforcement. So we want strong state enforcement. And as these efforts to redefine and reform state laws move along, and California will definitely be watched as a very large and powerful state with a very sophisticated attorney general's office with antitrust resources. Other states are going to go away and think, okay, well, how did that go in California? And how should we think about it in our own state? So, Robert, I will leave it at that for now and just throw it open.
Dr. Moss, thank you very much for touching on a number of things that we might delve into a little bit in more detail. I appreciate the comments, and there's so much to talk about. I mean, you touched on a number of industries. I mean, we could do a whole session just on the food sector, for example, and what we've seen there in the last number of years, any other sector. But just a friendly reminder for those in attendance, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom to ask any questions, and we'll try to kind of curate those and get them along to Dr. Moss. Let me begin with something that you kind of hinted at in your remarks, Dr. Moss, which is um, major changes this week at the Federal Department of Justice in their antitrust division. Gail Slater, who has run that now for about a year, who's been in the antitrust field for quite a while, is leaving. A couple of her top deputies, I think, left within the past month or two. So, and based on some of the reporting that I've seen, there was a Politico story that particularly got my attention. Feels like there has been a bit of a tug of war internally between those who actually want to go and enforce antitrust law, which is what they're supposed to do in the antitrust division of the Department of Justice, versus those who have been, my word, maybe meddling or interfering in some ways. Maybe let's talk, if you can talk about that at a big picture, and then I want to delve into a couple of specific cases and areas where there might be a profound effect on those cases.
Sure. So I think what happened this week with the ouster of Gail Slater, who, as we mentioned, is the head of the antitrust division. She's an assistant attorney general. Is really a cap off of a series of events that very much indicated that this was likely going to happen. When Trump took office a year ago, we were hoping for uh, we were hoping for more of what we saw in Trump 1.0, which was actually not bad enforcement. I mean, they did go after big mergers. The Trump administration 1.0 actually brought a couple of big monopolization cases. What we saw in Trump 1.0 was more traditional enforcement than certainly what we're seeing now. What we're seeing now bears no resemblance whatsoever to what we saw in Trump 1.0. It was made clear very early on that the White House would be inserting itself into major mergers. That's sort of where the interference has been concentrated, is in mergers. In fact, Trump announced just a few weeks ago that he would absolutely be interfering in um, uh, the uh, I'm sorry, the mergers around Warner Brother Discovery, whether it's Netflix or whether it's Paramount. He just came out and said it, right? And for people who are less familiar with how important it is for the Justice Department to remain independent, and for the Federal Trade Commission, the other antitrust agency, to remain independent and engage in independent, transparent, predictable decision making, it is an anathema that the White House would be interfering in this way. So it really shows up in two ways. One is companies know that to get their deals through, their first stop is the White House, and they need to broker some sort of deal. They need to curry favor. They need to pony up concessions to get their deals through, grease the skids, if you will. The White House should not be the first stop. And in fact, Gail Slater months ago said the DOJ should be your first stop if you're proposing a merger. That's number one. So that's been an enormous change. Number two, interference can come later. So, for example, in the White House, um, busting into an ongoing or a pending investigation or a pending settlement process and saying, you know what, DOJ, you don't need to worry about that settlement that you were working on. This is what we want you to do. This is the settlement that you should be looking at. And by the way, that settlement is politically motivated, or it's designed to reward political supporters of the administration. So,
Yeah.
so this is just what happened with Gail Slater's ouster. Gail was actually trying, I think, very hard to be an independent antitrust enforcer and to do her job. And it became really clear that it was going to be difficult for her to do her job. And the White House realized that, and she was removed.
Yeah, the reports indicate that she was kind of asked to resign, which
Yes.
she did, and those are appearing frequently enough in credible sources that I believe it to be true. I mean, certainly in the circles that the Consumer Federation of California, folks that we work with and talk to, and many of them here at the state level, but also some that we do a bit of national work, or we'll participate in certain coalitions or try to be helpful. Ticketing and live entertainment being one of those areas where we've been kind of, as a state group, kind of brought into some of those conversations. Folks were really feeling like Gail Slater, even if they don't agree
Mhm.
with her on everything, had this sense of the importance of antitrust enforcement and things like that. And I hate to say it this way, and I'm going to be careful so it doesn't sound crude or crass, but you referenced the Warner Brothers situation with the Netflix bid and then Paramount. I mean, when father and son Ellison are basically saying, "Hey, look, as part of this, if you want us to totally redo CNN so that it looks like kind of Trump News Network, we're happy to
Mhm.
do that." I mean, they all but said the quiet part out loud. I mean, that's the thing that just sort of screams out in so many of these areas with 2.0, even not compared to Biden or Obama or any previous administration, compared to Trump 1.0, even the difference is really stark. So um, let me delve for a minute into Live Nation. So Gail Slater is asked to resign. She does. Live Nation stock shoots up. Rumors are rampant of a settlement. And the rumors that are rampant of a settlement is not exactly a strong pro-consumer settlement. Full disclosure, we've been involved, CFC, in issues relating to what we refer to as the ticketing monopoly, live entertainment monopoly. Ticketing, it really doesn't do it justice because, representing artists, owning venues, exclusive contracts with the venues they don't own, it runs the gamut, as I know you know all too well. Can you just talk about what the impact could be to the Live Nation case and tie it in also to, again, DOJ, 39 states, and DC were all asserting that's an inappropriate monopoly. The brief is really great reading, to be honest with you. Oakview and other companies kind of acting as a shield for the monopoly. Irving Azoff and that company, his partner already got pardoned by Trump for a scandal in Texas relating to building of an arena at the Moody Center in the University of Texas. Can you talk about the potential impact? And then what does it mean? Can California or New York or other states that want to go forward, can it just kind of pick up that case and take it forward? Walk us through that for a little bit in this particular area on how that might look or work and flesh out.
Sure, sure. So the Live Nation case is actually a really good example of this devolution of enforcement into this politicized environment. Um, there have been a few cases that were setups. One was the Hewlett Packard Juniper Networks case, where the White House interfered at the last minute, appeared to interfere at the last minute in a settlement. Um, uh, Not in a settlement, but in an actual move by DOJ to enjoin the merger, to actually block the merger. And then there was the Jimmy Kimmel episode, where it became quickly apparent that the reason why Jimmy Kimmel was pulled off the air was because Tegna and Nexstar, two of the largest owners of local TV stations, wanted to curry favor with the White House, and they knew that Kimmel got under Trump's skin, and therefore, pulled his show off the air. So another example of interference. So what we have with Live Nation Ticketmaster is probably one of the most important antitrust cases in the United States, in the history of the U.S. They were allowed to merge in 2010. That was a very unfortunate decision. Ticketmaster at the time had 80% of the ticketing market. Pairing Ticketmaster up with Live Nation, with concert promotion and venue management, created this massive supply chain covering, blanketing the live events industry with tons of market power, and all these markets, the ability to leverage market power from concert promotion and venue management to ticketing. Consumers see it in the high ticket fees, the monopoly ticket fees, and DOJ made a bad mistake in allowing that merger to go forward. The conditions they placed on the company, which was not to discriminate against independent venues who wouldn't take Live Nation Ticketmasters, their ticketing service, they violated those conditions repeatedly. So under Trump 1.0 in 2020, DOJ reopened what we call the consent order, which is where all these conditions and remedies and fixes are contained, and said, okay, we've got testimony from venues. They are being threatened. They are being harassed because they're not taking Ticketmaster services. The threat being, if you don't take our ticketing services, then you don't get any concerts, or you get concerts on bad days of the week, or you get little known artists in your concert halls. So what Trump 1.0 did was they extended those ineffective conditions, which left us all in the antitrust community scratching our heads. Like, why would you extend already demonstrably ineffective conditions? And so when the Biden DOJ came in, what they did the right thing. They couldn't fix the problem using Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which is merger law. Instead, they had to bring a new antitrust case under Section 2 and 1 of the Sherman Act, which covers anti-competitive agreements and monopolization. And that's exactly what Live Nation has done. They have used these exclusive contracts, Robert, that you mentioned, to force independent venues to take ticketing services. It squeezes out competition in the primary ticketing market. It also messes up competition in the resale market. Um, and Live Nation has now pointed its finger directly at the resale market, and like, nothing to see over here in the primary market that oh, by the way, we have a monopoly in. So it's been an amazing public relations campaign. Anyway, DOJ has been gearing up to litigate this case. The trial is supposed to start in March. They have a very strong case. They got, as you said, 39 states and DC on the case. And the states have a big stake because they are trying to get damages for overcharges, monopoly overcharges on fees for all the consumers in their states. And what it appears to be happening is there has been pressure on DOJ to not go to trial, but instead to come up with some sort of settlement. And to answer your question specifically, Robert, the fear in my competition slash consumer community is that they will agree to some very ineffective, weak conditions in a settlement, allow the company to maintain its monopoly status, for example, and those conditions will not in any way, shape, or form restore competition, open the ticketing markets up to more, the primary market up to more competition. And Live Nation Ticketmaster will remain intact and able to continue to operate as a monopoly. I just can't. we're talking hundred, you know, tens of millions of people avail themselves of live events, sporting events, musical events. It's a really important sector. And so we're talking about, sorry to use this term, but screwing millions and millions of consumers by failing to use strong antitrust enforcement, independent antitrust enforcement at the Department of Justice to fix this horrendous competition problem in ticketing and to help consumers. It will be a disaster. It will be an epic failure of antitrust enforcement if this happens.
And just for the viewers, both live and then we put these recordings kind of out there so that other folks can pick up who couldn't make the live one. It's not like California can just say, okay, we're going forward no matter what you do, federal DOJ. Kind of doesn't work that way fully.
No.
Maybe you can take just a second to explain that, and then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, you may actually, Robert, you may need an antitrust lawyer to explain the process of how the case, the state's role in the case would be affected if I mean, the states could, I think they could step away from the federal case. But then the question is, well, you've got 39 states in DC who have a vested interest in litigating this case, going to trial, producing evidence, making the case that there was liability on the part of Live Nation Ticketmaster in violating the law, and getting damages, getting restitution for victims, consumer victims. So how the states you know, walk that line, I think remains to be seen. But I can tell you this: it would not be easy. It would be very complicated, and it would probably restart the clock on a case and create an even more protracted timeline to get relief to consumers that have been paying monopoly fees, ticket fees for decades, literally for decades.
Yeah, and this case was filed originally right around Memorial Day in
Yeah.
2024, if I recall correctly. So we're a couple 3 months short of 2 years. Antitrust cases are notorious for not being quick. There's lots of reasons for that. Discovery takes forever, etc. Um, the just two quick notes. One, the original merger was approved under the Obama administration. And rumors at the
Yep.
time were rampant that one or a number of the Emmanuel brothers were involved in one way or another. Rahm was
Hmm.
chief of staff to the president. His brother, he has two brothers, one who's been a healthcare reformer, who has a new book out that sounds fascinating about healthcare. But the third one is an agent and a big player in Hollywood. I think the model for the lead character in the HBO show Entourage many years ago. And so, whether how much of that is true or not, I do think that a number of folks in the consumer community were very concerned when the merger was approved. There's a little bit of, gee, you could have seen this coming
Hmm.
to roost now. Um, let me switch gears a little bit on on the California Law Revision Commission. You were one of the experts who had consulted with them as they obviously it tends to be many of the legislators and their staffers don't necessarily know CLRC very well. It's in a little bit of a backwater, but when they do get engaged in something, it's really terribly important work. They're very serious and earnest and studious about how they go about it. They're not in any particular hurry, sometimes to the eminent frustration of some of us who would like to take action. But the final recommendations, at least as it stands with single firm conduct, are quite strong. But you mentioned something that's, I think, important to understand, and maybe you can detail this a little bit more. Part of the problem, my view, my editorial comment with antitrust has been really decades worth of kind of pretty bad decisions that wound up sort of narrowing the scope so much that we were almost, and I'm oversimplifying when I say it this way, almost only focused on price, as if that was the only
Hmm.
thing that mattered in the antitrust world, when there's so many other things going on, suppressing innovation, market power, other conduct that's market power that isn't just raising prices. So I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit, because one of the fears is if you tell judges what to do too much, they resent it and they don't like being told what to do. But if you leave it too open, then you're almost begging for bad interpretations. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit in your experience.
Sure, and it's a really good question, and the way you framed it up, I think, is really is excellent, right? It's a very good way to sort of tee up the policy implications of what's going on with the single firm conduct rule. So you're absolutely right. Judges do not like to be told exactly what to do. They're judges for a reason, right? There are different ways. There's some latitude to interpret the law. That's why we get different decisions out of courts on various antitrust issues. Um, um, but you also don't want to give them you don't want to leave them without any sort of guidance or benchmarks or metrics to be able to look to. Um, that's the other extreme, right? Um, One thing about antitrust enforcement in the US is the agencies produce guidelines. So, for example, the latest set of big guidelines that came out of the federal agencies were the 2023 merger guidelines. Those guidelines are not binding on the courts. The courts don't have to follow the guidelines. The courts follow the case law. They follow the collection of cases that have worked their way through the courts and have set legal precedent all the way up to the Supreme Court. And by the way, we don't like to see antitrust cases go to the Supreme Court. We don't always get very good decisions, but in any event, the guidance that the agencies produce is non-binding on the courts. In the single firm conduct proposal that has been put forward by the CLRC, that state legislators in California will now be debating, there is also a statement that the California courts do not have to follow federal precedent. For example, a federal precedent says, look, you got to have some sort of benchmark for what what percentage of market share means that you have monopoly power. Usually that's north of 50%, right? Here's another one, easy one to understand. There's something called predatory pricing, which is pricing below cost to drive your competitors, your smaller competitors out of the market. Well, if you price below cost and they can't compete, they leave the market. And then once they're gone, you can jack up your prices. That's an anti competitive strategy. The federal precedent does say that, look, you have to be able to, show at least to convince a court that the monopoly priced below cost. And the single firm conduct proposal expressly says, look, we're not following that federal precedent. The courts can consider it, but they are not bound to it. And there's a bunch of other stuff that I don't, we two examples is fine, but there are others. And so that's part of the problem. Once you list all these federal precedents that the California courts are now no longer required to consider or not required to consider, since this is a new proposal, it may leave the courts wanting for more guidance. And to your second point is there absolutely should be a standard, right? We're trying to connect anti-competitive harm, to an effect. What is the effect? Well, the effect is on the consumer through higher prices, lower quality, less innovation. The consumer welfare standard encapsulates all of those effects, and unfortunately has gotten a bit of a bad, inaccurate rap over the years. As only, as you mentioned, Robert, pertaining to price effects, right? Well, if you can't show that prices went up, then you don't have a viable antitrust claim. That's actually not true. The consumer welfare standard looks at price effects, higher prices. It also looks at lower quality. We see this now in the digital cases, right, where there are no there's zero there are no prices in these markets. Consumers pay with their attention and their information. The courts are all over that stuff now. They are able to consider um, degradation or degraded quality as a result of monopolistic conduct. And we absolutely can talk about slower innovation as a result. So there is a standard that's flexible out there. And there is a concern with all I've said that's good about the proposal and strengthening antitrust enforcement in California. There is a concern that there is no way to connect the concerns in this expanded section of the Cartwright Act to actual consumer harm. And the courts really like that. They like that connection point. and it showed up even most recently in the decision on the Google search case with the remedies that the court was willing to accept. It has just shown up in the court's decision in the FTC's case against Meta in monopolizing personal social networking. So the consumer welfare standard is everywhere, and it's a very, very important concept. And there is a concern that there is no such standard in this proposal for single firm conduct.
That's very helpful, Dr. Moss. Thank you so much for talking about that. I mean, we could kind of go on forever because there's a lot of nooks and crannies here, but it's trying to find that kind of balance point. I mean, look, we wholeheartedly supported the now final, as of a couple of weeks ago, recommendations when it comes to
Yep.
single firm conduct. I should note for those viewing that the Law Revision Commission is still has pending a look at mergers and acquisitions and what, if any, changes should be made in that area. And that work will continue, and we'll continue along with other groups to pay quite a bit of attention to that to make sure that that we have tools in the toolbox to protect consumers and enhance
Yes.
competition and things like that. We talk a
Yep.
lot about, obviously, we're the Consumer Federation of California, so we talk a lot about the consumer side, but you want healthy competitive markets, right? I mean, it almost goes back to the sort of Adam Smithian notion of competition, kind of hundreds of years ago. I want to just really quickly talk about market segmentation as we wind
Hmm.
down, because, for example, in the Meta case, one of the problems that they had, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, was how do you define that market, especially in some of these newer media eras? You're the monopoly in this market, and then people say, well, is that the market? And then the companies kind of use that information. In Google, the problem, as I see it, was you got to the right answer, but then when
Hmm.
you get to sort of, okay, what are you going to do? Are you going to make Google sell off Chrome or spin that off or something? And then the judge was very reluctant to go down that road. Maybe can you talk just about that a little bit, the market segmentation, and then how this plays out? These are not easy cases on a good day, and of course, these are companies. Monopolies tend to have a lot of money because they're monopolies, and so they hire, a phalanx of antitrust attorneys that to get their viewpoint across to the court. Maybe you could speak to that for a minute.
Sure. When you say market segmentation, my read on that is, what we're trying to figure out, the market, the line of commerce that is being impacted by potentially anti-competitive activities, right? And part of the problem with, as you've already mentioned, in these monopolization cases, is they take a long time to litigate. Anywhere from 4 to 7 years. Antitrust is a slow moving process, and the digital markets are very dynamic, right? They're changing a lot. The role of AI is now really impacting digital markets. But in the Google case, it wasn't really disputed, that it wasn't a big issue of dispute, that this was the market for search. Activities, conduct in the search market. Uh, um, uh, there was not a big debate over the impact being on search. If you turn to the Facebook case, the Meta case,
Mhm.
that's where things really changed. When the case was first opened, the market was personal social networking, but that's back when people were sort of texting each other and messaging each other over a social networking platform. Things have changed since then. TikTok's in the market now. YouTube's in the market. So even in that period, that 2 to 3 year period of time, the market has changed. People engage in social media now more through videos, short form videos, that sort of thing. That's a big change in the market. It also expanded the market, and to that extent, almost made the competition problem go away that the FTC had originally alleged. So I think what this does is it tees up this tension between the speed of antitrust enforcement and changes in these very dynamic, quickly moving types of digital markets that we see. We don't see this in more Rust Belt manufacturing or utilities or that sort of thing. And so that dynamic, Robert, as you know, has really made it tough to think about antitrust reform at the federal level, at the state level. Um, there have been bills proposed at the federal level that are specific to the digital sector. There are bills now at the federal level that are specific to the healthcare sector. So we're keeping our eye on this space really carefully to see where things go. I think at the state level, obviously there is this urge to pass legislation that is specific to particular sectors because it may be harder given the different pace of innovation and change and dynamism in these sectors. The question is will antitrust continue to be a generalist form of law enforcement to protect competition, markets, and consumers, or are certain sectors going to break off because they behave so differently that this generalist approach is not going to work as well as it has in the past?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I know that sometimes in the state legislature, um, in California, if you got thousands of bills over a 2-year session, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and that tends to, among other things, lead to what I call kind of narrow casting, where things are much more
Hmm.
limited in terms of their impact. Sometimes you're trying not to pick as big a fight, for example, and so you
Hmm.
limit it to a particular industry, and that can have pluses and minuses. But I think
Right.
it's a really good point to maybe wind down on, Diana. We want to thank you very much for coming on and walking us through these issues. Stay tuned because obviously these issues are going to be debated very thoroughly in California as there will be a legislative proposal moving through the process dealing with the Law Revision Commission's recommendations on single firm conduct. And so um,
Hmm.
that'll be top of mind for the legislators and their staffers and those of us who care about this on both sides of the issue. So I want to thank you very much for you taking the time. And again, we'll make this available out for other folks to see who couldn't make it. Appreciate the comments and the answers to the questions, Diana, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Robert. Again, keep up the great work. What you do is extremely important, and we really do value at PPI. We value our collaborations with consumer groups. We're all sort of in this together. Consumers matter. They are the backbone of the economy, and we gotta protect them.
Thank you so much. We'll end on that note, Diana. Thanks again, and thanks
All
everybody
right.
who tuned in. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.